Good evening, everyone. In collaboration with the Mississauga Library System, we thank you for attending tonight's second lecture meet talk of the 2025-26 season. My name is James Malinowski, and I'm the Community Engagement Officer in the Experiential Education Unit within the Office of the Vice Principal, Academic, and Dean at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Reimagining Coleman, from the Department of Psychology and Brain Sciences, who will be delivering her talk entitled, Where the Lens Lingers, Reimagining Psychology Through Community-Engaged Research for Public Dissemination. Professor Ganapathy Coleman is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and Brain Sciences and director of the Center for South Asian Critical Humanities at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. For over 3 decades, her research has examined cultural psychological processes among Indian immigrant communities, with particular focus on parenting beliefs, childhood experiences, and the everyday routines through which immigrants navigate their cultural ideals. She has conducted comparative research with Indian Hindu parents in the United States, Canada, and Gujarat, India. Her current work includes a longitudinal interdisciplinary study of daily cultural practices in the Indian community in the Greater Toronto Area, and a second project examining the complex dynamics of cultural maintenance and adaptation within Indian and Pakistani diasporas in Peel region. Over to you, Professor Ganapathy Coleman.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Tonight, I want to explore how our everyday lives, the routines, the rituals, the seemingly mundane activities are actually sites of profound significance, creation, and transformation. My work focuses on how immigrant families navigate complexity and forge meaningful lives in new lands. But what happens when the traditional academic lens is replaced by the community's own viewpoint? So I want to start not with my words, but with theirs. I love going for a walk with my wife in the afternoon. For the first time, I went to Niagara Falls with my best friend. She came from London, Ontario, and we went there and went bowling. I went bowling for the first time, and I lost the game because I was a beginner. And then we went to Sky Wheel, and it was exciting. The last time I went on a Sky Wheel was in India when I was little. We saw Niagara Falls. These photographs were not taken by me, a researcher who has spent over 25 years studying how Indian immigrant families create new meaningful lives in new lands. The first was taken by a Pakistani origin retired man, a grandfather living in Brampton. This is the one I'm talking about. He used to work in a bank, and he was documenting what matters most for him in his everyday life. The second photograph, this one, was taken by a young community college student who had moved recently to this area. I go to masjid regularly for praying and Jummah prayer. I enjoy eating kheer. It is one of my favorite foods. I also make kheer often for our restaurant. Flowers on sister's hair. During occasions, mother always puts flowers on her and her sister's hair. Cultural practices keeping us connected with our motherland. Eid ul Adha, flowers grown from mom's flower garden at home. What you are seeing here challenges the narratives we typically hear about immigrant communities, that they struggle to fit in, that they are perpetually caught between two worlds, unable to fully belong to either. But look at these images. What do you see? I see joy, I see creativity, I see people actively constructing lives that are deeply meaningful to them. And tonight, I want to share how the exhibition, In the Quiet of Everyday Life, came to be. It represents not just a compilation of research findings, but a necessary and a fundamental shift in how we can approach the discipline of psychology, demanding that we recognize immigrant lives through their own terms, their own perspectives, and their voices. And so, I want to tell you what happened when we handed over the camera, both literally and metaphorically, and let communities document and interpret their own experiences. Now, South Asians are Canada's largest visible minority. We have a very long history here in this country, over a century, that is marked by both profound contributions and persistent discrimination. The first South Asians arrived in British Columbia in 1897, working in lumber mills and canneries. By 1908, there were over 5,000 South Asian migrants in Canada. But this history has also been marked by the Komagata Maru incident in 1914, by legal restrictions on immigration and citizenship, and by ongoing experiences of racism that continue today. According to the 2021 census, nearly 1 in 5 immigrants in Canada were born in India, with Ontario being the most common destination. In Brampton specifically, over 30% of the population is of Indian origins. This creates a geographic concentration that enables heritage practices to persist while adapting to local contexts, creating conditions for active cultural construction rather than simple preservation or assimilation. But here's what troubles me about how we typically study and talk about these communities. We use homogenizing labels like South Asian that flatten extraordinary diversity. And when I speak with my students and with the participants in my study and I ask them if they identify with this label of South Asian, many of them say that it was something they had to learn to do after moving to Canada. They do not think of themselves as South Asian. They think of themselves in many, many different ways. This label is a racialized and an externally imposed identity. And so we end up lumping together people from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka. And these are people who speak different languages, practice different religions, come from different regional cultures, different class backgrounds, and different caste positions. So this research challenges that homogenization by revealing the textured reality behind these labels. By inviting Indian and Pakistani immigrants to document their own lives, we see specificity, we see complexity, the internal negotiations and the collaborations that happen within concentrated immigrant communities. So my relationship with the Indian immigrant community actually began more than 2 decades ago. And from the beginning, my work has been deeply collaborative. So my work is grounded in what's called cultural psychology, the study of how people are shaped by their cultures and how they in turn shape the culture. It's founded on the idea that a person's mind and culture are inseparable, that they're mutually constitutive, influencing thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and motivations. So the field actually examines the mechanisms that exist behind cultural differences in psychological processes. My initial work was on parenting, and it was on a topic called parental ethnotheories. Parental ethnotheories are the implicit beliefs and the cultural models of child development and child socialization that caregivers hold. In that study of parental ethnotheories, I was studying how parents build and transmit culture through routines and recurrent activities that will gradually develop into overarching structures of meaning that guide life. And this work utilized comprehensive qualitative methods, including repeated in-depth interviews with each participant and observations, including with both participant and non-participant observations, with participants for over 2 years. So I spent more than 2 years engaging with families using methods like caregiver diaries, where I asked them to document their routines for extended periods of time. And I was not just dropping in for interviews with these participants. I was sitting at their kitchen tables. I was sitting in their living rooms, and I was attending temple ceremonies. I was listening as parents wrestled with profound questions about what to preserve, what to adapt, what to create anew, and what to transmit to their children as they raised offspring in an environment that they still considered to be quite foreign, even though they had lived sometimes for decades in places like the United States. So a key finding concerns the apparent appropriation of English socialization goals, English words like independence and family closeness. So parents would say, I want my child to be independent, or they would say, I want my child to be really close to their family. But when I ask them, what would that mean to you? What does that mean? What does the word mean to you? What does independence mean? Or what does family closeness mean? They would redefine those English terms by infusing them with their own culture. They were owning the word in this very specific way. So for instance, the word independence was conceptually linked not to individualistic separation, but to responsibility, to routine, to discipline, and to obedience, often manifesting as, quote, unprompted adherence to the daily routine, end quote, within established parameters. The goal was ensuring that their children understood that they had to perform certain tasks, quote, because you know you have to do them, not because I say to you that you have to do them, end quote. Similarly, the goal of family closeness was demonstrated through undisturbed moments of conversation and shared laughter. And this was often at bedtime, creating a safe environment for communication and disclosure between parents and children. So they were understanding these words very differently than we might imagine. In another aspect of that same study, I explored how Hindu parents used domestic spaces and religious narratives to foster cultural and spiritual identity in their children. And what struck me was how they made the divine personal and accessible. So Krishna was not a distant deity that they worshipped, but a companion that their child could relate to and depend on in their American context. Similarly, in my research with immigrant Indian women, I utilized life history interviews, navigating, these women were navigating displacement, they were forging new identities, they were asserting their agency against the stereotypes that were being constantly imposed on them by their communities. And they would shrug off the trope of the Bharatiya Nari, which is the quintessential Indian woman who is docile, passive, sexually particularly passive, very chaste, and who guards her honor very fiercely, and only comes out of her shell and becomes this fierce goddess-like creature when her own chastity or her family's honor and peace are shattered. But these women were trying to break out of that mold. They focused on their own personal agency very clearly and their own centrality to their own families. And here the philosophical framework of relational autonomy becomes relevant. So this framework recognizes that agency, our ability to act on the world for ourselves, characterizes individuals not who are all by themselves. They are individuals. They're just not out there as atomistic individuals, but they're people who are embedded in a web of relationships, and that it is within that web that you have to exercise your autonomy. These women revealed that authenticity is not about preserving some unchanging cultural essence, but rather a continuous and creative reconstruction of the self in response to a new transnational context. And this process of creative integration resulted in new forms of quote-unquote authentic Indiannesses for them and for their families and for their children. So throughout all this work, I was listening deeply. I was involving participants in validating my interpretations through what are called member checks, showing them my analysis and asking them, did I get this right? Is this what you meant? Does my interpretation make sense to you? Do you see yourself in what I'm writing and saying about you? I took their feedback very seriously, revising my understanding based on their corrections. Despite deeply involving participants and performing rigorous analysis that was validated by them through member checking, I recognized a profound limitation. I was still the one asking the questions. I controlled the scope of the investigation and ultimately filtered their narratives through my academic lens. I was writing up their stories. They were generous collaborators, but ultimately I controlled the narrative. This was a realization that troubles me. If I truly believed that immigrant communities possess sophisticated knowledge about building meaningful lives while managing multiple cultural systems, and I do believe this very strongly, then shouldn't they have more control over how that knowledge gets represented? Shouldn't public scholarship mean creating platforms for communities to speak directly, rather than always being filtered through academic interpretation? And this is what led me to Photo Voice and to the exhibition that we are discussing tonight. To situate this methodological shift, we must address what the indigenous scholar Linda Smith called the profoundly exploitative history of Western research towards indigenous and marginalized people. This history involved epistemic violence, the systemic exclusion or misrepresentation of non-Western knowledges and non-Western people. Decolonial psychology emerged to challenge this. These approaches ask, who gets to decide what counts as legitimate knowledge? Who benefits from research? How can research empower communities rather than just describe them? My adoption of Photo Voice is a commitment to decolonial psychology, which aims to undo coloniality and systemic harm in research. These frameworks are rooted in the value that psychology must reject ideologies of power over in favor of power with, facilitating a path towards healing and liberation through reclamation and centralization of perspectives that are routinely sidelined. Photo Voice is an ideal method for the shift because it operates explicitly as a community-based participatory research method, what's called CBPR, a method that is designed for individuals who traditionally possess limited power due to factors like race, ethnicity, class, and many others. The core goal of Photo Voice includes enabling people to record their own community's concerns, promoting critical dialogue and critical consciousness, a concept derived from Paulo Freire, and directly reach policymakers. By placing the tools of research, the camera, in the participants' hands, we engage in genuine power balancing. The goal is moving towards the highest level of CBPR participation, empowerment, where community members lead the process of decision-making in research. Let me explain how this worked. My undergraduate RAs, some of who are here today, we recruited 15 Indian and Pakistani immigrants living in Brampton, Mississauga, and Camden, ranging in age from 18 to 87. This was not a random sample. We purposely sought diversity across age, gender, religious affiliation, and immigration generation. So some of the participants had come recently from India or Pakistan. Others had been here for several years. They received training but not the kind of training you might expect. We did not teach them how to take good photographs in some aesthetic sense. Instead, we focused on rigorous ethical training to ensure that participants moved from being research subjects to being co-researchers responsible for ethical conduct. Our methodology included intensive formalized training sessions focused on the mechanics and the ethics of the photo voice method. So the scholarly literature around photo voice emphasizes that training must cover certain areas. One, it must cover some technical skills, so how to frame a shot, don't take a photograph in the dark, considerations of light and shadow, that sort of thing. Two, safety. So personal safety protocols, things like don't go to a place that you might not otherwise go to and take photographs. If you are threatened for some reason, just relinquish the camera and let it be. And if you feel that you are at risk, just don't take that photograph. Three, image ethics and privacy. So this is the most crucial scholarly step. The participants were explicitly instructed on verbal or written consent before photographing recognizable individuals. So protecting the confidentiality and the privacy of subjects. And crucially, they were instructed to not take any photographs that would indict, stigmatize, embarrass, or shame individuals or groups. So this was the prompt that we ended up giving the participants. Now, before I talk more about this, I want to point out that a scholarly approach requires confronting the tension that is inherent in applying ethical mandates, right? Teaching participants how to, what to do and how to protect themselves and the rights of the people whose photographs they are taking. So one aspect of this tension is that we are training the participants. We are saying it's participatory, and then we are training these participants. The second is that while vital and strict application of consent guidelines can unintentionally lead to the avoidance behaviors among participants, right? They may choose to avoid photographing people or sensitive topics to circumvent the difficulty of asking strangers for consent or dealing with emotional or cultural barriers. This avoidance can potentially limit our understanding of the phenomenon being studied. So there's this tension, and I must acknowledge it. We tackle these challenges as shared problems for sensitive subject matters such as potential stigma or illegal activity. Participants were informed during the consent process that such photographs had better not be taken, and that if they are taken, they may be excluded from dissemination because they may have the potential to harm an individual or a community. The core principle in all of this was deeply relational. So we problem solved together, we discussed potential concerns, and the participants made the final decisions on many of these things, demonstrating the operationalization of shared power. The participants also retained all rights and copyrights to their photographs. And then we gave them this prompt. What events, experiences, people, places, objects, and concerns make up your everyday life as an Indian or Pakistani immigrant in the Peel region? And we let them go. Over 2 to 3 weeks, they took 290 photographs on their smartphones. Then, and this is the critical moment, we brought them together in a facilitated workshop where they analyzed their own photographs. They grouped the images into themes, they debated what categories made sense, they wrote captions, and they decided what their photographs meant. The process of obtaining participant feedback on data analysis and interpretation is an ongoing requirement for rigor in research that is known as member checking. This step is vital in projects where vulnerable populations are involved, as it allows participants to redact photographs or comments that they prefer not to share, ensuring respect for their privacy, and establishing credibility for the data that we collect. And this is really where the power truly shifts. They were not just subjects providing data for us to analyze. they were active interpreters of their own lives. Several themes emerged from their analysis. Here I share 6 of those themes, and I want to emphasize they created these categories, not me. The first theme they called cultural traditions, and the caption they attached to it was connecting with roots. These are photographs of festivals, family milestones, celebrations. What is really striking to me, and this connects to my earlier work, is how these images visualize what I had only heard described previously. In my past research, my participants happened to be Hindu Indian parents, and they talked about this term called sanskar, a word that has roots in the Sanskrit word. It has roots in the word Sanskriti, which roughly translates to culture and heritage. Now, sanskar is a very complex term, roughly meaning culture, and they use this to convey the characteristics of the ideal child. So they would often use many other words. They would say the child should be truthful, child should be loyal, should be respectful of elders. But one of the things they underscored was that the child should be closely tied to their cultural heritage and their roots, and they want their child to live out this heritage in the choices that they make every day. So, before using the term sanskar, many of the parents would use all these other terms, and some of the parents would eventually use the term sanskar, but not all the parents. What was really interesting here is that it reminded me of the work of the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, who made a distinction between the fixed meaning of a word that you find in a dictionary and the more free-floating meaning of a word that appears when you use the word in a certain context, right? And the way it's used in a particular context doesn't often map on directly to its dictionary meaning. So there was a very clearly, very contextualized way in which these parents were using terms like sanskar and culture and cultural traditions and roots. But what I want to say is that here we see what sanskar looks like in practice. And I'm not trying to impose this term on the group. What I'd like for you to take away is the use of this, is the reliance on this, on the importance of cultural traditions as central to meaningful life. So here we see in the photographs the preparation of festival foods, the intergenerational participation in religious ceremonies, the way that physical spaces get transformed to accommodate rituals. The second theme they called family and family memories. And the caption they attached to it was, happy moments are the ones in which we spend quality time with our families bonded by love, and the importance of relationships and family ties. Here there were photographs of shared meals, of family gatherings, of children and grandparents together, of Mother's Day celebrations. In my prior work also, I found that many of the parents I spoke to emphasized family closeness. And here we see what that closeness actually looks like from their perspective. And what did they photograph? Not the big special occasions necessarily, but the ordinary moments of being together, the small celebrations of life that validated their relationships with family members, meals, conversations, the quiet everyday togetherness. That is what they took photographs of. The third theme was well-being. Now, this was a caption from one of the participants. Walking is blissful in any weather. I don't leave my chance to get out in Mother Nature as it detoxes me physically and emotionally. Here they took photographs of exercise, of hobbies, and this revealed a very holistic understanding of well-being that goes beyond the absence of illness. In my previous research, some of the parents I spoke to often emphasized daily routine, and some of them used the word dinacharya, daily routine, as a pathway to well-being. The photographs show that in action: morning walks, the tending of potted plants, the creative practices that nourish the body and the spirit. The next theme was religion and spirituality, and the caption they attached to it was connecting with our inner peace and positivity and soul refreshness. This is a translation. They used the term ruh ki tazgi. That was the term they used. Religion and spirituality offer meaningful ways to connect with the self. Younger participants described their spirituality as a source of inner strength and positivity, a quiet force that nurtures resilience in everyday life. Older participants reflected on the role of religious practice in providing ruh ki tazgi and sukoon. For them, faith was not only a spiritual anchor, but it was also a way to stay rooted to their cultural heritage. Many of them also emphasized the value of learning about different religions, noting that this type of knowledge deepens our understanding of the world and fosters greater empathy across communities. Another theme that they emphasized was food, and the caption they attached to it was finding comfort in food and also experiencing new cuisines. This was the caption that the younger participants attached. The older participants jokingly said, "Pet bhara so sab bhala," which means, if your stomach is full, everything looks good, everything looks fine, all's good with the world. So food is essential for sustenance for these participants, but its meaning runs much deeper. It brings families together, offering a shared space to socialize. It creates new memories, and it helps us to reflect on old ones. Mealtimes become moments of connection, comfort, and celebration. For many of them, food was also a bridge to the past, a sensory link to distant childhood memories and treasured family traditions. Older participants in this study expressed a strong preference for healthy, fresh, home-cooked meals, lovingly prepared with quality ingredients and with care. For younger participants, food was a space for exploration and experimentation, a way to engage with new culinary experiences. And at the same time, they acknowledged the health risks associated with the frequent consumption of sweets and fried foods, highlighting the growing awareness around balanced eating. And then the sixth theme, hardships, hurdles, and concerns. The older participants captioned it the dangers and disadvantages of technology, and the younger participants called it embrace the chaos. This one surprised me the most. So for the older participants, they said that technology was a boon, but some of the participants said that, they used social media like WhatsApp to stay in contact with extended family members on other continents. And they said that on the one hand, they were excited when they saw a message flash up on their screen. And on the other hand, they were terrified that they were going to receive bad news from an extended family member. And they said that in this way, technology becomes a source of joy as well as stress. These participants documented a lot of different hardships and difficulties: financial struggles, health challenges, bureaucratic nightmares, culture shock, the grinding difficulties of immigrant life. They did not hide these challenges. They did not sanitize their experiences for public consumption. But notice the framing of the younger participants. Embrace the chaos. Not survive the chaos, not endure the chaos, embrace the chaos. And this is a statement of agency and of resilience, of actively engaging with difficulty rather than being passively overwhelmed by it. I want to be careful here not to let their resilient framing minimize the weight of these struggles. These are real struggles. My ongoing study is examining these systemic barriers, the structural difficulties in much greater depth. So these 6 themes, hardships and hurdles, food, religion and spirituality, well-being, family and family memories, cultural roots and traditions, became more than just findings. They became the foundation for the next stage of this work. This Photo Voice project was the first phase of an ongoing cultural, psychological, and ethnographic study. The themes that these participants identified are precisely the ones that my students and I are currently exploring in depth through the main study. And to ensure that we continue this collaborative approach, I'm currently working on putting together a community advisory board that will provide formative feedback throughout the research process. They can redirect us if necessary. They can help us to fine-tune our questions and our methods. And they can keep us accountable to the priorities of the community rather than just our academic ones. Transforming this community-based research into a public exhibition required navigating several tensions between scholarly rigor and public accessibility, between honoring participant voices and creating a coherent visitor experience. The first challenge was text. Academic training pushes us towards comprehensive explanation, providing context, theoretical frameworks, methodological details. But exhibitions are not academic papers. Visitors don't read dense text that is put up on walls. Yet, we also need to avoid the opposite, the extreme of reducing these complex lives to simple captions that might flatten the very nuance that we are trying to preserve. So we went through multiple iterations. Early drafts had too much text. My students and I kept wanting to explain, to contextualize, to provide background. We had to keep asking ourselves, whose voices are centered here? Are we trusting the photographs and the participants' own words to communicate, or are we imposing our academic interpretation as necessary mediation? We ultimately decided that each photograph would have the participant's caption, their words, unedited, as the primary text. Additional context would be minimal, relating to theme descriptions that the participants themselves had created. We moved a bunch of the text to a digital companion so that people were not forced to see this wall of text in the in-person exhibition. Why did we not involve the participants in the production of the exhibition? We worried that involving participants in every aspect of the exhibition design would have been participatory to the point of being extractive, asking them to donate even more labor amid their busy lives to develop expertise in curatorial practices on top of everything else that we had already asked them to do. There is a difference between meaningful participation and exhausting consultation. But there's also the real question of whether we were making strategic decisions or were we simply reverting to researcher control, traditional researcher control, when the going got tough. Now I want to reflect on what we learn when communities hold the camera themselves. In my earlier work, that collaborative but still researcher-controlled work, I analyzed how my participants navigated tensions in cultural adaptation. I looked at competing demands, at the strategic decisions they made about what to preserve and what to adapt. I examined how they appropriated English words like independence and family closeness and then refracted them through cultural concepts, through their own cultural lens, giving these English words entirely new meanings grounded in their own heritage values. That analysis was not wrong. Those tensions exist. Those strategic negotiations do happen. But when they held the camera, their lens lingered elsewhere, on quiet moments of care, on connection, on creativity and joy, on the ongoing work of making meaningful lives. This does not mean that one perspective is right and the other is wrong. It just means that different questions get asked depending on who's doing the asking. My lens, shaped by my training in cultural psychology, oriented me towards conflict and adaptation, also meaning-making and connection and joy. Their lens, shaped by their lived experience, oriented them towards meaning-making and resilience. Both are true. The difference is that we rarely get to hear their perspective, unfiltered. This project taught me and my students difficult lessons about power and about collaboration. My students, trained in traditional psychological methods, they had to unlearn being the expert. They had to practice saying, I don't know, what do you think? Or I don't know, you decide. And meaning it. They had to get comfortable with not controlling the outcome, or the process for that matter. The participants were initially surprised. More than one asked, "This is great, we are here, we've never been here. What made you invite us to be here?" More than one asked, "You want us to decide what is important? You're not going to tell us what to photograph?" This surprise itself reveals something about how research traditionally works. Even in collaborative research, communities are often not setting the agenda. But then these community members were delighted, empowered, and they took their responsibility seriously and they took ownership of the process. We navigated everything as shared challenges, and I had to really learn how to share power and not just consult, and that was just uncomfortable. And it meant giving up control. It meant accepting that the final product might not align perfectly with my theoretical framework or my publication goals, but look at what we gained. Throughout my career, I have argued, based on extensive ethnographic work, that immigrants don't simply preserve old culture or assimilate into new culture. Instead, they purposefully and creatively integrate their culture of origin with their host culture to create what I call new kinds of authentic Indianness for themselves and for their children. And these photographs are evidence of that ongoing creative work. Look at the festival photographs, traditional practices, but celebrated in Canadian homes with locally available ingredients on Canadian holiday schedules. Look at the family meals, South Asian foods served alongside Canadian foods, traditional seating arrangements adapted to Canadian furniture. Look at the religious observances, temples and mosques that replicate Indian architecture but serve communities that navigate Canadian employment schedules and children's hockey practices. These are not people frozen in time, desperately clinging to some unchanging tradition. These are not people abandoning their heritage to fit in. These are people who are engaged in really sophisticated cultural work, daily thoughtful decisions about food, faith, festivals, family, that are intentional acts of cultural construction and of self-definition. And in living in communities within the Peel region, where there is this dense population of Indian and Pakistani immigrants, where you can speak Punjabi in the grocery store, or where the public library has Diwali celebrations, or where in the public school, children are performing Gidda. In these places, there is space for celebrating their culture, and it creates the spaces needed for creatively adapting culture to suit their particular needs in this transnational context. Why does this matter beyond the academic? Research that stays locked in academic journals serves no one but academics, for the most part. When I publish in journals like Ethos or the Journal of Family Psychology, which I do, and that work matters. It's important work, it's necessary work. It builds theoretical frameworks, it advances scholarship. But the reality is that I reach perhaps 100 specialists. When we create a public exhibition where community members speak directly, we reach people who can actually use this knowledge. Other immigrants who see their experiences validated, service providers who will gain insight into the communities they serve, policymakers who may make decisions affecting immigrant lives, and young people growing up in communities who need to see their complexity reflected back to them. This exhibition does work that my academic papers cannot. It challenges stereotypes, it creates empathy, it provides counter-narratives to the stories that are typically told about immigrant communities. And the ultimate fact here, the ultimate collaboration here, is that the community's voices will reach you directly, unfiltered by my academic interpretation. Exhibitions of this type that are based on community-based participatory research are action, they're not just description. They move beyond documenting lives to actually intervening in public discourse, challenging how immigrant communities get represented and influencing how they get understood. I've shown you about 9 photographs tonight out of the 290 that the participants, that my research collaborators took. And I shared 6 of the themes that they created. There were many other themes, and each theme contains dimensions I have not touched, moments of humor, unexpected beauty, provocative questions, and difficulties and issues that have no easy answers. And the exhibition, In the Quiet of Everyday Life, will give you what my talk cannot. It will give you time to linger where you want to linger among those photographs. It will give you time to read the participants' own words, not just a few that I have selected. And it will give you the time to make your own discoveries about what the lives of these immigrants reveal to us. So I invite you to attend In the Quiet of Everyday Life, which is opening this Thursday at UTM. But when you go, I would like for you to remember, this is not just my research. This is the community's research. I was a facilitator, yes. My students and I, we provided the framework. We held the space for the analysis, but they were the researchers. They were the storytellers. Listen to what they have to say. These are the details of the exhibition. Opens on the 9th of October at 6 p.m. at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. There is an opening reception. Please be there if you can. We'd love to see you there. And these are all the people who worked on this research. Thank you, and I am happy to take your questions now.
Any questions, guys? I don't know how relevant this would be, but in your research, because you talked about how Indians and Pakistanis kind of created their new authentic Indianness and Pakistaniness, did you find tensions between generations of maybe like older generations trying to cling on to their identity maybe back home versus newer generations creating that new authentic identity?
So the question is whether there was a tension between the versions of authenticities that the older generation believed in and that the new generation was trying to create. In this community-based research project, we did not see those tensions as much, but I can speak to this from my work, from my previous work, and based on the conversations that I have with my students who offer me the privilege of, glimpses into their lives. So when I say authentic Indianness or authentic Pakistaniness, I think I should clarify that I'm not trying to essentialize authenticity. I'm not trying to say, oh, here's this one version of heritage culture or tradition. What I'm trying to say is that these people are trying to do what feels true to them. It's based on what they think is right and what is sincere for them, and that what resonates with them. And so even among the older generation, particularly people in the age range of the 30s through the 50s, I saw that they were also re-articulating these ideas of authenticity. What is authentically Pakistani or what is authentically Indian? And there were many versions of this. And I spoke with some of these young adults and middle-aged adults who talked quite a bit about the tensions they sometimes experienced, because some of them felt a pull to refresh their sense of identity in a new environment. They had been raised in India or in Pakistan, and here they were in this new context, and they saw this as this amazing opportunity to recast themselves outside of their context. And they talked of the tension of doing that and the sorts of challenges they faced from members within their community who acted as gatekeepers, for instance, within the community, or who said that there's this one authentic way of being Indian or Pakistani for that matter. And so there was that tension. Among my students and among younger participants, I've heard them talking about the difficulties they face when they try to articulate their particular version of being Indo-Canadian or Pakistani Canadian, and the sorts of generational dilemmas that raises for them in their interactions with their parents. I think that the process of figuring out who you are in this context, whether you came as an immigrant or whether you are a second-generation immigrant who was born here, that process of figuring it out, I think, is common to all generations, but it plays out, the choices that are made are very different, I think, between different generations. And so there are tensions that are experienced both by the parents and the older people who are trying to lay claim to certain versions of cultural authenticity, and then the tensions that younger people face as they redefine themselves in light of their experiences of being Indo-Canadian or Pakistani Canadian. Yes.
The question I have is that how do your participants or your students react to to conflicts that are occurring in their countries of origin or their parents' countries of origin? Do they get that? Does it transfer into their daily life here or into their interactions with each other? That okay, they were enemies there. Are they enemies here, or is there that thing about a broader South Asian identity?
That's a really important and really interesting question. And there are there are political tensions,
yes,
right?
Exactly.
And these are very real, and there is a history of this, and it's a reality. And I don't want to sweep that off under the carpet. But I think that in this particular project, as I've done this, I have not really seen people being, concerned about those political tensions. What you see is this. What you see are people just trying to live their lives every day, in a transnational context, and they are more concerned with, how do they make their life meaningful, and so for them, it's not really about these political tensions. It's not about that at all for them. It seems to me. They are here, and they are mingling with one another, and they are forming friendships with each other, and they are living. They don't talk. I'm not sure to what extent those political tensions are also surfacing in, whether they're getting any of that through in their interactions with their parents. So far, I have not heard this from my students or from my participants. So in this study, I had the participants saying things like, you have to learn about different religious traditions, and it opens your mind, it makes you a better person, and so on. So they were really talking about things in a much different way than the political tensions in the home countries might lead us to think. Yes.
So, invariably, when two cultures meet, there is a lot of positive things that happen, but there is also some friction or points of contention that may come up. For example, Diwali is coming up, and I think one point of contention is fireworks, right? The Mississauga mayor wanted to ban them. So, I'm not asking like where do you stand on that, but how do you develop like a mental model or a thought process to develop some abstract, not abstract empathy, but objective empathy on how to build tolerance, like looking on the other side and trying to see they're on the opposite side. So how do you navigate that thought process?
Let me say the question back to you so that I understand, and so that I make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. You're saying, how do you build tolerance and view things from the community's perspective in this country that they're living in now? Am I understanding you correctly?
So the existing residents, people who have been here, in a sense, natives, it's an alien concept to them. The fireworks, it bursts and then it disturbs their pets, it startles them. So it's not a pleasant experience for them. Whereas on the other side, there's a point of friction. So how do you, what is the thought process of looking at it without taking a stand on a side, picking a side? How do you objectively try to navigate that friction?
How do you objectively navigate the friction of differing viewpoints between groups that may come to the same situation, to the same issue with very different mindsets? That's what you're saying. Well, it's actually a really difficult question to answer, and I think that it's a question that has implications beyond these communities and just the question of, say, fireworks, right? I think that in all situations, you have to, there's this notion of a fusion of horizons, where that is, you have to work towards coming to a point where two opposing viewpoints can at least have a conversation, even if they don't come to an agreement. So, I would, that's what I would say very broadly on any issue where there are differing viewpoints. I think that as human beings, we have to cultivate that kind of intersubjectivity where we are able to actually understand another person's perspective and at least have a conversation about it, even though we may not agree on what happens in the end, right?
We'll take questions from online.
Yeah, we do have a bunch of questions that came in.
Okay.
So from Romilla, who says, excellent presentation, Professor. I appreciate your focus on providing agency to the research participants. Their question is, any plans on expanding your research to expand on the concept and understanding of Sanskar and how it is defined and perceived by the community?
So any plans on expanding the research and understanding of the concept of Sanskar?
Yes, and how it is defined and perceived by the community.
Yeah, no, I mean, the concept of Sanskar, it's really, really interesting. And in some ways, I ended up focusing on it in my previous research because I happened to work with a group of participants who were all Hindus. I have often thought of expanding that work on Sanskar and studying it further within the community. I think that there'll be something really interesting to study there, especially because I've learned subsequently that the concept of Sanskar is used very differently by young people in places like India. They are using it very differently. They use the term in almost a satirical way, and it no longer carries the kind of meanings that it used to carry traditionally. So they are using it as a term to kind of play with, and so they're redefining it in a lot of different ways. So I have not really studied that concept since I studied it back then. I don't have any immediate plans to do so. Although I imagine that as I get through this big, large-scale study that I'm currently working on, there will be participants who will bring up concepts like this, and then I'll explore those concepts if they bring them up. But I'm not planning on exploring just that concept for itself.
Okay, thank you. And one more.
Okay.
I think some of this was already covered, but how the notion of authenticity was addressed in this research, what risks were highlighted during the research, and was empathy dominated or not?
How was authenticity addressed in this research? So I did not go after the term authenticity really in this particular research. I just wanted to see how these participants see themselves and their lives. And so in that sense, it was authenticity, but I was not going after the philosophical term of authenticity. I was just mainly concerned with a sincere a way to capture the ways in which these participants remain true to their own beliefs and their understandings of who they are and who they want to be. So I was not chasing the term authenticity, that itself. It just happened to come out in these ways. And I would say that the photographs give you a kaleidoscopic view of these different forms of authenticity within these two communities. You know, that's what it gives you.
Did you want to respond back on the last two? What risks were highlighted during the research, and was empathy dominated or not?
Was empathy dominant or not? So as a person, you know, I was not studying empathy. I think that's something that I should make clear, because within psychology, there are psychologists who study empathy. And I did not study empathy itself. There were photographs that conveyed an understanding of empathy or that encouraged empathy within the community and between people in general, but it was not a research on empathy itself. What was the question about risk?
It was, what risks were highlighted during this research?
I'm not entirely sure I understand that question, but I'm going to try to answer it by thinking that it focuses on, is it hardships or separation from cultural values? I'm not entirely sure what that question is trying to communicate. Maybe the person who's asking the question can type in their clarification in the chat, and then I can answer it.
Sounds good.
There was a, yes, please.
Yeah, first of all, I think fantastic, very interesting research, especially
Thank you.
literally the eyes of the people. So my question is related to next steps. So, for example, now that you established a baseline, you can actually probably see how their integration with society and how they integrate, how it evolves. Because those pictures, I'm sure, from those 6 categories would change over time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the second question I have just related to this is, it'd be interesting how it compares to other communities, right? I know it's outside the scope of the research, but it'd be very interesting to know, do other people have similar categories, similar experiences that they're seeing?
Yeah.
Especially even outside in other countries next door, like the U.S. I know we're very unique here in Canada, but
Yeah.
really, I think, emphasize that part.
So what happens next? The question is what happens next now with this project? There were 2 parts to this. You know, one that, you know, some of the participants said that they would like to continue Photo Voice, you know, but then there are real constraints around this. You know, ideally, the community will continue the Photo Voice, and they'll be able to train other people to do Photo Voice, and in this way, the community will keep sharing photographs that reflect its priorities and its concerns. But the reality is that, you know, Photo Voice requires resources. And, you know, and it's very hard to find those resources. And unfortunately, even for participatory research, we end up relying on institutional resources that the communities may not have ready access to. So one of the things I'm planning with is to try to find community partners, you know, organizations that may be interested in this type of work and who we can pair with to continue this kind of work. So that's one thing that we are considering. And then the second thing is that the results from this study, the themes that these participants identified, they identified many more themes than this. These were the top themes. We are using those themes as the foundation for conducting this longitudinal research. So there's a research project that's ongoing. It's going to go on for 5 years, and we are studying 120 participants of Indian and hopefully also Pakistani origins. And our plan is to obtain detailed information about these themes. So we are in the process of doing that. You know, my undergraduate students, we are working on this. We are in the process of conducting repeated in-depth interviews with many different participants, We've started doing some visits to community locations to conduct observations there. And our plan is, and so we just started about less than a year ago, and so our plan is to sort of keep going with this so that we go past these photographs even and really capture all the nuances of the different themes that these participants highlighted. That is an ongoing study.
So before we move forward with in-person questions, we'll finish the ones online.
Okay.
And we'll end the video, and then whoever's left in the audience can feel free to continue.
So one more question that's online. Is the study vulnerable to reinforcing the blind spots in self-perception of the study contributors? And what level of deviation was found within participant themes, and how were they treated? So, for example, weighted or eliminated?
No, we do not weight or eliminate any of the responses. And, I mean, this is a really good question, and it's a really important question. We are not saying that, so these were 15 participants, right? We are not saying that what we captured in this is the sum total of everything that these communities stand for. We are not at all saying that. We are just saying this is what these 15 participants told us about their lives. And, did it reinforce their own biases about themselves? Possibly. I think that research as a process is vulnerable to bias. However much you may try to do this perfect research that is unbiased, there are biases. And it's quite possible that the participants refrained from taking photographs that may have shown their community as badly or for their lives as difficult. It's possible. But having said that, the participants were also really open about capturing photographs of many of their hardships. They talked about their shattered dreams. They took photographs that were symbolic of the shattered dreams of immigrants. They took photographs of health issues, all the different medicines that they have to rely on. So they were also quite honest about what their lives were like. And I think, and again, going back to this idea that we are not trying to capture the full range of their experiences. We can't do that. It's impossible for us to do that. We're just trying to start a process where the community participants where they are able to show themselves as they want to show themselves, and where they have the right to interpret their own lives instead of having researchers and other people interpret their lives for them, right? So they are telling their story themselves, and that's the most important part of this. No doubt there are things that are not included in it, and no doubt there are stories and vantage points that are not included in this project.
Okay, so we're just about hitting our time frame to the end of the session. So if you wanted to address any questions on the floor, maybe we can do it after if you're still
Absolutely.
available.
If
not, because we are recording this session, I just wanted to say thank you to UTM, and thank you so much to Professor Reimagining for being here tonight and for the thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.